Danny Cole wiped the grease from his hands and looked at the work order on his tablet. And his stomach turned cold when he read the location because it said, Detention Block 7, Cell 17. And nobody wanted to go down there. The space station Orion 6 was old and falling apart. And Danny spent most of his days fixing broken pipes and faulty wires. But this assignment was different because this was the prison section where they kept the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. Commander Lisa Morgan sat behind her desk with her arms crossed. And she looked at Danny with eyes that showed no emotion as she explained the situation. The climate control system in Cell 17 is broken, she said. And the prisoner inside needs specific temperatures to survive. So you need to go in there and fix it. Danny looked at the temperature readings on his tablet. And they were all wrong because the room was supposed to be warm and humid. But instead, the numbers kept jumping up and down like a broken heart monitor. What kind of prisoner needs those conditions? Danny asked. Even though part of him already knew the answer and did not want to hear it. A Dracorian. The commander replied. Danny felt his blood run cold because everyone knew about the Dracorians. And they were the most terrifying species in the known galaxy. And they looked like the dragons from old Earth stories with huge wings and sharp claws and scales that could stop a bullet. And they could breathe fire hot enough to melt steel. The war between humans and Dracorians had been going on for 10 years. And Danny had lost his father in the first attack when a Dracorian ship destroyed the colony where his family lived. And he had spent his whole life hating these creatures and fearing them. You want me to go into a cell with one of those things, Danny said. And his voice cracked a little even though he tried to sound brave. The prisoner is sedated and restrained, Commander Morgan said. And there will be guards outside the door the whole time. So all you have to do is go in and fix the heating system and get out. And it should take about 30 minutes. Danny wanted to say no. But he knew that was not an option because mechanics on a space station did not get to choose their assignments. And if he refused, then he would lose his job and be sent back to Earth with nothing. Grabbed his toolkit and walked out of the commander's office without saying another word. And his footsteps echoed in the empty corridor as he made his way down to the detention level. The deeper he went into the station, the colder and darker everything became. And armed guards stood at every checkpoint with their weapons ready. And they all looked at Danny with expressions that said they were glad they did not have to go where he was going by the time he reached Cell 17. Danny had passed through 6 security doors and 3 scanning machines. And his heart was beating so hard that he could hear it in his ears. 2 guards stood outside the cell. And one of them was a young woman named Corporal Tina Hayes, who Danny had seen around the station before. She's unconscious, Tina said. But be careful in there because these lizards are tricky and you never know what they might do. Danny nodded and pressed his hand against the panel next to the door. And there was a hissing sound as the heavy metal barrier slid open. And a wave of hot, wet air hit him in the face like a slap. Stepped inside, and the door closed behind him with a loud clang that made him jump. And for a moment, he just stood there in the darkness trying to let his eyes adjust to the dim orange light. The cell was bigger than he expected. Maybe 10 meters wide in each direction, with walls made of thick metal designed to withstand plasma blasts. And there were no windows and no furniture except for a single drain in the middle of the floor. And there in the center of the room lay the Dracorian, which was huge, easily 4 meters long from the tip of her nose to the end of her tail. And her scales were the color of copper and bronze, and they seemed to shimmer even in the low light. And her wings were folded against her body like a bat, sleeping in a cave. Heavy metal bands held her legs and arms in place. And a mask covered her face, pumping sedative gas into her lungs with a soft, rhythmic sound. Danny stood frozen for a long moment, just staring at her, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest to make sure she was really asleep. And then he forced himself to move toward the climate control panel on the far wall. The problem was easy to see. because one of the heating coils had burned out completely, and a second one was about to fail. And it was a simple repair that Danny had done 100 times. Before on other parts of the station, he opened his toolkit and got to work, pulling out the broken coil and preparing to install a new one. And he tried to focus on the task and ignored the massive creature lying just a few meters behind him. He was about halfway done when he heard something that made his hands stop moving. And it was a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once and vibrate through the floor and into his bones. Danny turned around slowly, still holding his tools, and his breath caught in his throat when he saw that the Dracorian's eyes were open. They were golden and beautiful and terrifying all at the same time, with narrow black slits in the center like a snake. And they were looking directly at him with an intelligence that made him feel very small and very fragile. The rumbling sound continued, and Danny realized it was coming from her throat like a growl or maybe a purr. And he did not know which one was worse. "Easy," he whispered, holding up his empty hands to show he was not a threat. "I am just here to fix the heater, and then I will leave." The rumbling stopped, and the Dracorian tilted her head to one side like a curious dog. And then she did something that shocked Danny more than anything else that had happened that day. She spoke. "You are the first human to enter this cell in 3 days," she said. And her voice was deep and smooth with a slight hiss on certain sounds. "And the others only watch me through the window like I am an animal in a cage." Danny's mouth fell open, and he could not find any words because he had never known that Dracorians could speak human languages. And the voice coming from this terrifying creature was almost gentle. "You can talk," he finally managed to say. "All Dracorians learn your language," she replied, "because we have been listening to your transmissions for many years. And I have been speaking it since before this war began." She shifted slightly in her restraints, and Danny saw her wince in pain. And he noticed for the first time that her scales near the restraints were rubbed, raw and bleeding. "The sedatives are wearing off," she said, "because they always do since my body burns through them faster than your doctors expect." Danny glanced at the door and calculated how long it would take him to reach it if she broke free. And he knew the answer was not fast enough. "I am not going to hurt you," the Dracorian said. And there was something in her voice that sounded almost sad. "Because I could have killed the last 3 technicians they sent in here, but I did not. And I have no desire to add more death to this war." Danny stared at her and did not know what to think, because everything he had ever been told about these creatures said they were savage and cruel and loved nothing more than killing humans. But the being in front of him did not seem like a monster at all. "Why are you here?" he asked. "And why are you a prisoner if you do not want to fight?" The Dracorian let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but it was hollow and tired. "I am here because I surrendered," she said. "And I came to this station by choice, seeking asylum. But your commanders do not know what to do with me, so they keep me locked in here while they argue about my fate." Danny could not believe what he was hearing, because Dracorians were supposed to fight to the death rather than surrender. And the idea that one would willingly give herself up to the enemy went against everything he thought he knew. "Why would you surrender?" he asked. The Dracorian's golden eyes softened, and Danny saw something in them that he never expected to see in an alien predator. And it looked like fear and hope and desperate love all mixed together. "Because I am carrying eggs," she said quietly, "and I will do anything to keep my children safe." Danny stood completely still with the soldering iron forgotten in his hand, and the words the Dracorian had spoken echoed in his mind and changed everything he thought he understood about this creature and this war. "Eggs," he repeated, and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "3 of them," she confirmed, and her voice was soft and full of emotion that Danny had never expected to hear from an alien. "And they will hatch in less than 1 month if everything goes well. Danny set down his tools and took a careful step closer to her. And now that he knew what to look for, he could see the slight roundness in her midsection, hidden beneath the sin beneath. Armored scales, but definitely there. I fled my homeworld to give them a chance at life, the Dracorian continued. Because I wanted them to grow up away from the war and away from the military. That would have taken them from me the moment they hatched. Danny listened with growing horror as she explained how the Dracorian military worked. And she told him that all hatchlings were taken from their mothers before they could even open their eyes. And they were raised as soldiers and trained to fight and sent to die on distant battlefields before they ever had a chance to live. I watched it happen to my first clutch, she said, and her voice broke slightly on the words. And I held them for only a few hours before the soldiers came and took them away, and I never saw them again. And I will not let that happen to these children. So you came here, Danny said slowly as understanding dawned on him. And you surrendered to the enemy because you thought we might help you. I came here because humans are the only species in this part of the galaxy that seems to value individual life, she replied. And I have studied your culture and your history for many years. And I know you are capable of terrible cruelty, but also great kindness. And I am gambling that you will show kindness to me and my children. Danny did not know what to say because his entire life he had been told that Dracorians were monsters who started this war for no reason except that they enjoyed killing. And he had believed it because believing it was easier than thinking about the enemy as real people with families and hopes and fears. But the creature in front of him was not a monster. And she was a mother who was scared and desperate and willing to throw herself on the mercy of her enemies, just to give her unborn children a chance at life. What is your name? Danny asked. Because suddenly it seemed important to know. She looked surprised by the question, as if no one had bothered to ask her that since she arrived. Calith, she said. And what is your name? Danny Cole. Danny Cole. She repeated slowly like she was tasting the sounds. That is a strange name, but I like the way it sounds. Danny found himself smiling even though nothing about this situation should have been funny. And he turned back to the climate control panel and started working again. But his mind was far away thinking about what Calith had told him, thought about his own family and his mother who had raised him alone after his father died. And he thought about his little sister back on Earth, who he had not seen in 3 years because travel between planets was restricted during wartime. And he thought about what it would feel like to have your children taken away from you before you even got to know them. The temperature problems, Danny said as he worked on replacing the broken coil. They are dangerous for you and the eggs, right? Yes, Calith admitted. Because Dracorian eggs need very specific conditions to develop properly. And if the temperature drops too low for too long, then the embryos inside will die. Danny's jaw tightened as he examined the damaged heating coil more closely. And something about the way it had failed did not look right to him because it did not look like normal wear and tear. And instead, it looked like something had been deliberately broken. Has anyone else been in here since you arrived? He asked. Like any other technicians or guards or anyone. Calith thought about it for a moment before answering. A man came 2 days ago, she said. And he told me he was checking the air vents. But he spent a long time standing at that panel and doing something I could not see. Danny looked at the burn marks on the coil and felt cold anger building in his chest because now he was almost certain that this was not an accident. And someone had sabotaged the climate control system on purpose. Someone wanted Calith's eggs to die. He did not say anything to her about his suspicions because he did not want to scare her. But he made a decision right then that he was going to find out who did this and why. I'm going to fix this, he said, and his voice was harder than before. And I am going to make sure it does not happen again. Calith watched him with those ancient golden eyes that seemed to see right through him. Why would you help me? She asked. When I am your enemy and my kind killed so many of your people. Danny paused and thought about the question carefully before answering. My father used to tell me something when I was young, he said. And he said that how you treat people who cannot fight back says more about who you are than how you treat your equals. And right now, you are about as helpless as anyone can be. He turned back to his work and added in a quieter voice. Besides, I have never been very good at following orders when those orders are wrong. For the first time since he entered the cell, Keleth made a sound that Danny recognized as genuine laughter. And it was a strained rumbling noise like distant thunder, but there was warmth in it. You are an unusual human, Danny Cole. Yeah, he agreed. I get that a lot. They talked more while Danny finished the repairs. And Keleth told him about her homeworld and what it was like to grow up there. And she described massive forests of crystal trees and oceans that glowed with bioluminescent life and mountains so tall at their peaks reached into space. She told him about her mate, who had been a warrior and who had died in a battle 2 years ago. And she described how she had loved him and how losing him had nearly destroyed her until she discovered she was carrying his last children, and Danny found himself telling her things too. Like how his father had died and how his mother had never really recovered from the loss. And how he had joined the station crew, not because he believed in the war, but because he needed to escape from a planet full of painful memories. By the time Danny finished the repairs, the cell was warm again, and the humidity levels were stable. And he had installed backup systems that would keep everything running, even if the main coils failed. But he knew this was only a temporary solution, because if someone on this station wanted Keleth dead, then they would find another way to make it happen. I have to go now, he said as he packed up his tools. But I will come back tomorrow to check on the systems and make sure everything is still working. Keleth nodded slowly, and there was gratitude in her eyes, but also sadness, because they both knew that tomorrow was uncertain. Thank you, Danny Cole, she said, for treating me like a person instead of a monster. Danny paused at the door and looked back at her, and he saw not an enemy or a threat, but a mother trying to protect her children. And in that moment he knew that his life had changed forever. Get some rest, he said, and try to stay warm. He pressed his hand to the panel and the door slid open, and he stepped out into the cold corridor where the guards were waiting. And he walked past them without saying anything because he had too much to think about. Someone on this station was trying to kill a pregnant mother and her unborn children, and Danny was going to find out who it was, even if it cost him everything. Owed that much to his father and to the man his father had raised him to be. Danny could not sleep that night because his mind kept racing with questions about who had sabotaged the climate control and why they wanted to hurt Keleth and her eggs. And he lay in his small bunk staring at the ceiling until the early hours of the morning, when he finally decided to do something about it. The station's computer system kept records of everything that happened on board, including who went where and when and what they did. And Danny knew that if someone had tampered with the climate control, then there would be evidence somewhere in those files. He waited until the station was at its quietest, which was around 3 in the morning when most of the crew was sleeping. And then he made his way to the engineering bay where the oldest computer terminals were located. These terminals were not watched as closely as the ones in the main control room, and Danny's security clearance was just high, enough to access the maintenance logs without raising any red flags. He sat down at a dusty terminal in the corner and started searching through the records for Cell 17. And what he found made his blood run cold. The log showed that a technician named Greg Paulson had performed a routine maintenance check on the cell 2 days ago. And Danny knew Greg because they had worked together for almost a year. And he was a quiet man who did his job and never caused any trouble. But when Danny looked at the schedule for that day, he discovered something strange. because according to the records, Greg was supposed to be repairing a water recycler on the other side of the station at the exact same time he was. Supposedly in the detention block, it was impossible for Greg to be in both places at once, which meant someone else had used his security credentials to access the cell. Danny dug deeper into the files and pulled up the security camera footage from the corridor outside cell 17. And the video quality was poor and grainy, but he could see a figure approaching the door wearing a maintenance uniform. The figure was too tall and too broad in the shoulders to be Greg. And when Danny enhanced the image as much as the old system would allow, he saw something that made his heart stop. The man in the footage was wearing a small pin on his collar that showed he was a command officer. Danny sat back in his chair and tried to process what he was seeing, because this meant that someone in the station's leadership had deliberately tried to kill Calith's eggs and had framed an innocent worker to cover their tracks. His first instinct was to go to Commander Morgan and tell her what he had found. But something made him hesitate, because she was the one who had assigned him to fix the climate control in the first place. And she had known about Calith's pregnancy and the temperature problems. It's possible that the commander herself was involved in this conspiracy. Danny did not know who he could trust anymore, because the only person on this entire station who had been completely honest with him was a prisoner, an enemy, a creature that everyone said should be his mortal foe. He copied the evidence onto a small data chip and slipped it into his pocket. And then he erased his search history from the terminal and walked out of the engineering bay with his mind made up. The next morning, Danny went back to the detention block with his toolkit and a bag of extra supplies. And the guards outside cell 17 looked at him with suspicion, but let him pass when he said he needed to check on the repair. Calith was awake when he entered, and her golden eyes lit up with something that looked like relief when she saw him. "You came back," she said. "And I was not sure you would. I told you I would," Danny replied. And then he lowered his voice and moved closer to her. "And I found something you need to know about." He told her everything he had discovered about the fake maintenance log and the security footage and the command pin on the saboteur's collar. And Calith listened without interrupting until he was finished. "I suspected as much," she said when he was done, "because I knew there were people on this station who would rather see me dead than allow me to live. And they see my children as future enemies who must be destroyed before they can become a threat. That is insane," Danny said. "Is it?" Calith replied. And she tilted her head in that curious way that reminded him of a bird. "Because your species has a long history of destroying what it fears. And it is one of the things you share with my own kind." Danny could not argue with that, because he knew his history. And he knew about all the terrible things humans had done to each other throughout the centuries. And he understood that if people could commit such horrors against their own kind, then they would have no problem doing the same to an alien race. "What do we do?" he asked. Dilith was quiet for a long moment, and Danny could see her thinking carefully about her answer. "There is a shuttle bay on the lower levels of this station," she said finally. "And it is used for cargo shipments and is mostly automated with only a few workers during the night shift." Danny nodded because he knew the place she was talking about. A small bay called Section 7 that handled supplies coming in from other stations. "If I could reach that bay," Calith continued, "then I could take one of the cargo shuttles and leave this system. And there's a place 3 days from here that is outside both human and Dracorian territory. A neutral zone where refugees from both sides of the war have built small colonies." She looked at Danny with hope and desperation in her eyes. "My children could be born there," she said. "And they could grow up free from this war and free from the hatred that has consumed both our peoples." Danny understood what she was asking him to do, and he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. If he helped Calith escape, then he would be committing treason against his own kind, and he would lose his job and his freedom and possibly his life. And everything he had worked for would be gone, but if he did nothing, then 3 innocent children would die before they were ever born. And the mother who had risked everything to save them would be left to watch helplessly as her eggs grew cold. He thought about his father and the lessons he had tried to teach Danny before a draconian weapon ended his life. And he thought about what it really meant to be human, and whether being human was about biology or about the choices he made. "Okay," Danny said, finally. "I will help you escape. But we need a plan over the next 2 days." Danny used his maintenance access to map out everything they would need to know, including the patrol routes of the guards, and the schedules of the shift changes, and the best path from the detention block to Section 7. Keyleth told him about her own abilities and how long she could survive outside her temperature-controlled cell, and how far she could move before exhaustion set in. And they worked together to figure out the timing of every step. The hardest part was going to be the restraints, because they were controlled by a central security system that required high-level authorization to deactivate. And Danny could not hack them directly without setting off alarms all over the station, but he realized there was another way, because the restraints drew power from the same electrical grid as the climate control system. And if he overloaded the heating coils with enough energy, then the surge would fry the circuits in the restraints and give them a window of maybe 30 seconds before backup systems kicked. And it was risky, and if the timing was wrong by even a few seconds, then everything would fall apart. But it was the only option they had. They chose to make their move on the 3rd night during the shift change, when security coverage would be at its weakest. And Danny arrived at Cell 17 carrying his toolkit and a thermal blanket that would help keep Keyleth warm outside the cell. "Are you ready?" he asked at Keyleth. Flexed her claws and tested the restraints that held her down. "I have been ready since the moment I surrendered," she said, "because I'm tired of waiting for others to decide whether my children will live or die." Danny moved to the climate control panel and began the overload sequence. And the heating coils started to hum with building power until the air itself seemed to vibrate. "Now," he said. There was a flash of light and a shower of sparks, and the magnetic locks on the restraints released with a loud crack. And Keyleth pulled herself free for the first time in weeks. She stretched her wings, and they filled the cell from wall to wall. And Danny realized how truly magnificent she was, with her copper scales gleaming and her golden eyes burning with fierce determination. "Stay close to me," he said as he wrapped the thermal blanket around her midsection to protect the eggs. "And try not to hurt anyone unless you have to." "I make no promises," Keyleth replied. And Danny still could not tell if she was joking. They moved into the corridor, and the escape had begun. The corridors of the station were dark and quiet as Danny led Keyleth through the maze of passages towards Section 7. And every shadow seemed to hide a threat, and every sound made his heart jump into his throat. Keyleth moved surprisingly quietly for a creature her size, and her claws barely made any noise on the metal floor as she followed close behind Danny with her wings folded tight against her body. They passed through 2 security checkpoints without being seen, because Danny had memorized the patrol schedules and knew exactly when the guards would be looking the other way. And each time they slipped past unnoticed, he felt a small surge of hope that maybe this crazy plan would actually work. The station was cold compared to Keyleth's cell, and Danny could see her shivering beneath the thermal blanket as her body struggled to maintain its temperature. But she did not complain, and she did not slow down, because she knew that stopping meant death for her children. They were 1 level away from the shuttle bay when everything went wrong and alarms started blaring throughout the station. A loud wailing sound that echoed off the metal walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. And a computerized voice announced that there had been a containment breach in the detention block. "They know," Danny said. And fear gripped his heart like a cold fist. "Then we run," Keyleth replied. They abandoned all attempts at stealth and sprinted down the corridor towards Section 7. And Keyleth's powerful legs carried her faster than Danny could have imagined while he struggled to keep up with his lungs burning from the effort. The door to the shuttle bay was just ahead, a heavy metal barrier with a control panel glowing beside it. And Danny slapped his hand against the scanner and prayed that his credentials had not been revoked, yet the door slid open. They burst into the shuttle bay, and Danny's heart sank when he saw two guards waiting for them with their weapons raised and pointed directly at Keyleth. And one of them was Corporal Tina Hayes, who Danny had spoken to outside the cell. "Do not move," Tina commanded. And her voice was steady, but Danny could see confusion in her eyes. "Danny, what the hell are you doing?" "Tina, please," Danny gasped as he tried to catch his breath. "You do not understand what is happening here. And someone sabotaged her cell and tried to kill her children. I have proof that it was someone in command." Tina's weapon wavered slightly, but she did not lower it. "That is impossible," she said, "because command would never authorize something like that. Check the maintenance logs for yourself," Danny pleaded. "And check the security footage from 2 days ago, because someone used fake credentials to access her cell and overload the heating coils. And they were wearing a command pin on their collar." The other guard, a young man named Tyler, who Danny did not know very well, kept his rifle aimed at Keyleth and showed no sign of lowering it. "Orders are orders," Tyler said. "And you need to step away from the prisoner right now." Keyleth's throat began to glow with building heat as plasma gathered in her flame glands. And Danny knew that if she released that fire, then people would die, and any chance of escape would be lost. He stepped in front of her and put himself between the dragon and the guards. "If you want to shoot her, then you will have to shoot me first," he said. And his voice did not shake, even though he was terrified. Tina stared at him for a long moment. And Danny could see the battle happening behind her eyes as she weighed her duty against her conscience. And he remembered all the times they had talked in the cafeteria about how wrong this war felt and how tired they were of all the death. Then she lowered her rifle. "Tyler, stand down," she said. The young guard looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Corporal, we cannot just let them go," he protested. "I said stand down," Tina repeated with steel in her voice. "Because I have heard the rumors too about what is really happening in that cell, and what some people on this station are willing to do in the name of winning this war." She met Danny's eyes, and he saw something there that looked like respect. "Go," she said, "and get her out of here. But you better be right about this, because if you are wrong, then we're all dead." Danny grabbed Keyleth and ran toward the nearest cargo shuttle, a beat-up old ship that had seen better days, but had working engines and enough fuel to reach the neutral zone. He was just starting to power up the systems when the bay doors exploded. Inward, with a deafening crash, Commander Lisa Morgan stood in the light, opening with a squad of armed soldiers behind her, and her face was twisted with cold fury as she surveyed the scene. "Mr. Cole," she said, in a voice that was terrifyingly calm, "step away from the prisoner, and we can discuss this like reasonable adults." Danny's hands flew across the shuttle controls as he tried to get the engines online faster. "There is nothing to discuss, Commander," he said without looking at her. "Because I know what you did, and I know you tried to murder her children." Morgan's expression flickered for just an instant, but that tiny reaction told Danny everything he needed to know. "You do not understand the situation," she said, "because those eggs represent 3 more Dracorian soldiers who will grow up to kill humans. and I am trying to protect our species from future threats by murdering babies," Danny shot back. "Because that is not protection, and that is just another war crime." The shuttle's engines roared to life, and the soldiers raised their weapons. But before they could fire, Calith unleashed a blast of plasma that was not aimed at them, but at the floor in front of them. The metal deck melted and buckled from the intense heat, creating a barrier of molten slag that forced the soldiers to jump back or be burned. And the delay gave Danny the seconds he needed. "Hold on," he shouted. The shuttle lurched forward and blasted through the bay doors into the cold vacuum of space. And Danny pushed the engines to maximum power as he pointed them toward the jump coordinates that would take them to the neutral zone. Alarms blared inside the shuttle, and warning lights flashed on the control panel. But the old ship held together as they accelerated away from the station. Through the rear display, Danny could see the station shrinking behind them, and he could see smaller ships launching from the docking bays in pursuit. But they were too slow, and the shuttle had too much of a head start. "The jump point is 2 minutes away," Danny said as he checked the navigation computer. "And once we make the jump, they will not be able to follow us." Calith moved to stand beside him, and her massive form filled the small cockpit, but somehow it did not feel cramped. And she looked out at the stars with an expression that Danny had never seen on her face before. It was hope. "You have given up everything to help me," she said quietly. "And you have abandoned your home and your people and your entire life for a creature you were raised to hate." Danny watched the jump countdown ticking down on his display and thought about everything he was leaving behind. His job and his friends and any chance of ever going home again. And he knew that he would probably be a wanted criminal for the rest of his life. But then he thought about the eggs Calith was carrying, and the 3 children who would never exist if he had made a different choice. And he knew in his heart that he had done the right thing. "My father used to say that being human is not about where you come from or what you look like," Danny said, "but about the choices you make when it matters most." The jump drive activated and the stars stretched into lines of light as the shuttle tore through space toward freedom. And Danny felt something shift inside him, like a weight being lifted from his shoulders. "I made my choice," he said, "and I can live with it." Behind them, the station disappeared into the distance. And ahead of them lay a new life in a place where neither humans nor Dracorians had any power. And for the first time since he was a child, Danny felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Shuttle flew on through the stars, carrying a human mechanic and a pregnant dragon toward a future that neither of them could have imagined. The neutral zone was everything Calith had promised and more. A vast stretch of empty space far from the battlefields where neither humans nor Dracorians had any authority. And the stars here seemed brighter somehow, as if they were welcoming the 2 refugees. After 3 days of travel, the shuttle reached a small moon orbiting a massive purple gas giant. And on that moon was a settlement called Haven, where people from a dozen different species lived together in peace. The colonists asked no questions about where Danny and Calith came from or why they were running, because everyone in Haven had their own story of escape and loss. And they only wanted to know if the newcomers were willing to work hard and contribute to the community. Danny found a job in the settlement's maintenance department because every colony needed people who could fix broken machines. And his skills were valuable in a place where resources were scarce and nothing could be wasted. Calith surprised everyone by becoming a translator because she spoke not only human languages, but also several other alien tongues that she had learned during her years of studying the galaxy. And her ability to help different species communicate made her an important part of the community. They built a small home together on the edge of the settlement, a simple structure made of metal panels and recycled materials. But it was warm and safe, and it had a special room where the temperature could be carefully controlled for the eggs. 3 weeks after they arrived, the eggs began to hatch. Danny was there when it happened, because Calith had asked him to stay with her. And he sat beside her in the warm room and watched as the first cracks appeared in the copper-colored shells. The hatching took several hours, and Danny held his breath each time a tiny claw poked through the surface or a small piece of shell fell away. And he felt emotions he could not name welling up inside him as new life struggled to enter the world. The first hatchling emerged just after midnight. A small creature about the size of a house cat, with scales the same copper color as its mother and big golden eyes that blinked in confusion at the bright lights. The second one followed a few minutes later, and this one was slightly larger with darker markings on its wings that Caliph said came from its father. And then the third one broke free from its shell. And Danny gasped when he saw it, because this one was different from the others, with scales that shifted between copper and deep crimson like flames frozen in metal. "They are beautiful," Danny whispered. Keyleth gathered her children close to her chest, and a deep rumbling purr vibrated through her body as she held them for the first time. And Danny saw tears forming in her golden eyes. "What will you name them?" he asked. "The first will be called Ash," Kella said as she looked at the copper hatchling, "for the fire that burns within all Dracorians and gives us strength." She turned to the second one with the dark markings. "This one will be Stone," she said, "because he will grow to be strong and steady like the mountains of my homeworld." Then she looked at the third hatchling, the one with the crimson scales, and she turned her gaze to Danny. "And this one," she said softly, "will be called Hope, because that is what you gave me when everything seemed lost and I had nothing left to believe in." Danny felt something break open in his chest, and he had to look away for a moment because he did not want Caliph to see him cry. But she had known him long enough now to understand what he was feeling. "You are part of this family now, Danny Cole," she said, "whether you want to be or not, because you saved us all, and we will never forget that." In the weeks that followed, news of their escape spread through the refugee networks that connected the scattered colonies of the neutral zone, and stories traveled from settlement to settlement about the human mechanic who had risked everything to save an enemy and her children. Some people called Danny a traitor because he had betrayed his own kind and helped a Dracorian escape. And there were humans in Haven who refused to speak to him or acknowledge his presence, but others called him a hero because he had shown that it was possible to see past the hatred and fear that had driven the war for so long. And they said that if one human and one Dracorian could become friends, then maybe there was hope for peace someday. Danny did not care what anyone called him, because he knew the truth in his own heart. And when he watched Ash and Stone and Hope playing in the red dust outside his window, he knew that he had made the right choice. The hatchlings grew quickly, and within a few months they were already learning to speak. And they called Danny by a Dracorian word that roughly translated to uncle. And they climbed all over him whenever he came home from work and demanded that he tell them stories about Earth and humans and the galaxy beyond. Their small moon Caliph watched these interactions with warmth in her eyes. And sometimes Danny caught her looking at him with an expression he did not fully understand, but which made him feel like he belonged somewhere for the first time in his life. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the gas giant and painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Caliph joined Danny on the small porch outside their home. "I have been thinking about what you told me," she said, "about how your father believed that treating the helpless shows who you truly are." Danny nodded but did not speak because he could tell she had more to say. "I believe your father was very wise," Caliph continued, "and I believe that his wisdom lives on in his son, because you could have turned away when you learned the truth about me, and you could have fixed the heating coils and left and never known what was happening." She placed her clawed hand on his shoulder, and the warmth of her scales felt like sunlight. "But you chose to see," she said, "and you chose to act even when it cost you everything. And that is what makes you a truly good person regardless of what species you are." Danny leaned into her touch and looked out at the children who were chasing each other through the dust with their small wings flapping uselessly because they were still too young to fly. "I just did what felt right," he said. "And that," Kelleth replied, "is exactly my point." The children shrieked with laughter as Stone tackled, hoping they rolled across the ground in a tangle of wings and tails. And Ash stood over them making a sound that was halfway between a growl and a giggle. Danny watched them and smiled because this was why he had done it. Not for recognition or to make a statement, but because these children deserved to live and their mother deserved to raise them. And somewhere in the vast coldness of space, there had to be room for mercy and compassion. Being human meant more than just having human blood in your veins. And it meant choosing every single day what kind of person you wanted to be, and then having the courage to live by that choice. Danny had made his choice in a prison cell on a space station far away, and he had never regretted it for a single moment. The sun continued to set, and the stars came out one by one. And the three hatchlings eventually tired themselves out and came inside to curl up in their warm room. And Danny and Kelleth sat together in comfortable silence. As the night settled over, Haven somewhere out there the war was still raging, and humans and Dracorians were still killing each other over territory and resources and ancient grudges that neither side could even remember anymore. But here on this small moon in the middle of nowhere, a human and a dragon had built something new. And three children were growing up without hatred in their hearts. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Danny looked up at the stars and thought about his father and wondered if somehow he could see what his son had become. And he hoped that wherever he was proud. "Thank you, Dad," Danny whispered to the sky, "for teaching me how to be human and far away in the darkness." The stars seemed to twinkle just a little bit brighter. The end.